The Bible has lessons that are applicable to every generation. And God has chosen to record selected incidents from much of the long history of Israel to teach those eternal principles. Apostle Paul said in Romans 15, "Whatever things are written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." And so today we have an incident that has very powerful lessons in relationships both personally and ecclesially. It involves the dynamic priest Phinehas, a man we've looked at before. And in Joshua 22 we have a very, very valuable lesson from this man Phinehas. Phinehas came bursting into history in Numbers chapter 25, perhaps the most dramatic, bloodthirsty incident and piece of action in the Bible besides Samuel chopping up Agag. But in doing so, he protected the door of the tabernacle from the evil doctrine of Balaam. God says his violent but zealous action made an atonement for Israel. And God left us in no doubt what he thought of Phinehas. Admitted to the Melchizedek priesthood, the first after Abraham and Christ. His action was counted for righteousness for evermore. And Yahweh was with him. And we know that he took over the sons of Korah and passed on his zeal for the door to become their family policy, that we'd rather be doorkeepers than to dwell in the tents of wickedness, and that God will hold no good thing from those that walk uprightly. And the sons of Korah eventually got the priesthood under Samuel. They became dedicated keepers of God's house, guides in the tours of the temple, as well as the leaders among the singers. And zeal was ignited in the next generation by Phinehas. But then he was to spend the rest of his life fighting corruption or threatened corruption in Israel. He was to lead the army against the Midianites, not Joshua, a priest leading the army. He destroyed Balaam, who was responsible for the loss of so many of his brethren's lives. In the early days of the Judges, the terrible incident of the Benjaminites that happens in chapter 21 and chapter 20, they call upon Phinehas to come to try and decide the issue. And Phinehas does his best in a very difficult, tricky situation. But whenever corruption rises up, Phinehas is called for. And we're going to see today in Joshua 22 that there was a supposed apostasy that took place. Again, Phinehas is called to lead the delegation that goes across the other side of Jordan. But on this occasion, they had wrongly jumped to conclusions. The satisfying thing was that the matter was resolved peacefully and civil war was averted. Now we know the history of this incident because we studied it from Numbers chapter 32. Remember how Moses had argued with his brethren who wanted to sit still on the east of Jordan and not go over to war with their brethren. And the problem of selfishness we saw in Numbers 32. And after long negotiation, they made a covenant that they would cross over before their brethren and before Yahweh, that they would fight for the land until the land was conquered. A covenant that got 4 specific mentions. Reminded by Moses just before he died. Immediately Joshua is appointed, and now we have it again here in Joshua chapter 22. They'd left their families unprotected east of Jordan for 7 long years, trusting in God that God would look after their families, and they kept their covenant. And so we come to Joshua, and we look at this record of the family of the children of Manasseh. Remember, the issue had been, why sit ye here while your brethren go to war? It will discourage people. So, they'd made this covenant. Now come to Joshua 22. We're going to carve up the chapter of Joshua because we need to learn very much from this controversy that takes place at a place called Ed. Here's what the chapter is about. It's a long chapter, so let's just begin by breaking it down into smaller pieces. In verse 1 to 9, they are sent to claim their inheritance. In verse 10 to 14, there is a scandal and a reaction to that scandal. In verse 15 to 20, when the delegation arrives, they make hasty accusations. Fortunately, we see the maturity and the growth of the tribes of Reuben, Gad and Manasseh in the way that they respond to that challenge. A restrained, an honest, a careful reply is made to very hasty and rude accusations, as a result of which there is rejoicing and repentance. And then when Phinehas comes back to the other tribes on the west, a faithful report brings joy to all. And so we have a situation where a problem, a potential issue, is resolved. And there are lots of lessons about how the process was handled, both by those who made the accusations too quick and by those who were accused. And they are the ones that shine. Their reaction of non-retaliation is something we can all learn from. So we've had 7 years of conquest. Major resistance on the west of Jordan is now subdued. It's up now to each tribe to clean out the remaining Canaanites from their inheritance, tribe by tribe. And so in verse 3, they are commended for keeping their covenant. You have kept your charge, says Joshua to them. And he sends them off with a blessing and an exhortation in verse 5, that they should keep the ways of Yahweh and love Yahweh their God. Later on, we find in verse 7 and 8 that Manasseh are similarly blessed and encouraged by Joshua and given a share of the spoils. And this was happening at Shiloh. Verse 9, it says they departed from the children of Israel out of Shiloh. And that's a very important detail because this was a very difficult parting. They had fought shoulder to shoulder with their brethren, with Yahweh going before them for 7 years. They would have become very close to people in the other tribes. You just wonder how these fighting men were actually fed. Very likely they were accommodated by the families of the other tribes. And so there was a bond that had developed between these men and their brethren. And now they have to leave and go east. But the last thing happens at Shiloh, and there probably were offerings made to thank God for the victory so far. And when they left, the last thing they saw was the smoke of the altar at Shiloh, as the peace offerings and the burnt offerings went up as they departed from their brethren. And they go east. And when they arrive to the River Jordan, the enormity of the impending separation hits them. These were not days with phones, Skype, email, or easy travel. The River Jordan floods every year and becomes an almost impassable barrier. And they realised the isolation from their brethren that would take place once they were living amongst the rugged hills of Gilead and Bashan. Travel would not be easy, and there was no mail service, not even snail mail operated in those days. And as they cross over Jordan, and you notice in verse 13 it says, at the passage of the children of Israel. And I believe they came to the same spot where Israel had crossed over going into the land, where they had gone before the ecclesia. And you know, it was very clear in Joshua 4 that when they crossed over, that Reuben had been elevated to the front of the marching order. So God was recognising the spiritual progress of these tribes. And they come to the place where they're now going to be separated from their brethren. And they were justifiably concerned. And so they came to a place that later became known as Ed. And we believe it was the place of crossing. They were justifiably concerned that the next generation of their children would not feel the close bonds of kinship that they had developed with their brethren. So what they did was to build this huge altar 20 miles north of Jericho. And I want you to note the most important detail. It was before they crossed over. It was on the western side of the river. Besides the fact this would delay them getting home to their families, which they were desperate to do, They put the time and the resources into building an enormous altar on the western side of the River Jordan. Archaeologists have unearthed the ruins in this place, and they found them inscribed with the words Abin Ed, the going up to Ed. So we actually have archaeological proof that this place existed. Now we need to notice the detail about this altar, and we're going to concentrate upon verse 10. Because what it says there in verse 10, they built there an altar by Jordan, a great altar to see to, which is a very clumsy translation. But this is the key to what happens here. What they built was a huge replica of the altar that was in the tabernacle at Shiloh. That point of departure that they left from Shiloh. To try and commemorate their connection to their brethren, they built a huge replica of that altar. And Rotherham says it was of large dimensions. The Jerusalem Bible says an imposing altar of great size. Moffat and the Jewish Tanakh say a great conspicuous altar. And there is the key. That's why they made it so big. It was not the same size as the altar at Shiloh. It had to be seen from a distance. Look down at verse 28. They said, look, when they were explaining this later on, therefore we said that it shall be when they should so say to us in our generations to come, behold the pattern of the altar which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings or sacrifice, but a witness between us and you. And what they wanted to do was in the future that when they maybe couldn't come across Jordan because it was in flood, that they could bring their children to the other side of the River Jordan and say, see that big altar over there? That's the worship that we had with our brethren in Shiloh. So it had a purpose of being a uniting influence and not a divisive influence. It had to be large to be visible across the river. And it was never intended to be used for sacrifice. It would have been incredibly impractical. And given perhaps the guess at some of the size of this altar, that you can see it from that distance, it would have taken a forest just to burn one sacrifice. So it was never intended for that purpose. It was large because they wanted it to be viewed from a distance. And that was their good intention of building that altar. And then we come to verse 11, and here's where the lessons really start to come home to us. We're told both in verse 11 and in verse 12 that the children of Israel heard of it. How often in ecclesial life, brethren and sisters, and in personal life sometimes, do we only hear half the facts? The other half of what we hear is embellishments and imputed motives. Oh, do you hear what that ecclesia is doing? I know why they're doing that. They've always hated us. And it goes like that, doesn't it, when the story is reported? Today we hear so much unsubstantiated gossip that is transported by Facebook and Twitter, much of which is inaccurate, most of it unhelpful, and much of the gossip unbrotherly. But it's always couched in terms of concern for the brotherhood. So be very careful what you hear, brethren and sisters. Now you notice the response that when they heard, and they didn't just hear that an altar had been built, what they heard was that an apostasy had been committed. People had drawn assumptions from the fact that they had built an altar not in Shiloh, that this was now the beginning of a great apostasy. And it says this, that the children of Israel gathered themselves to Shiloh to go to war against them. When you come down later in the chapter, in verse 33, they actually stopped their intention to go against them, to battle and to destroy them. So this was going to be a civil war in which the 9.5 tribes on the western side were gearing up to go over and to totally obliterate the 2.5 tribes on the east. That was what they were gearing up to do. They were gathered to go together to war against them. And you can imagine them all sharpening their spears and thinking, well, we have to wipe out this apostasy. They were very sensitive to apostasy. They still remember what happened with the Balaam incident. They remember what happened with Korah. They remembered what happened with Achan. They were very sensitive to apostasy. And when they heard this story about an altar being built, a disaster on our hands. We've got to go and wipe them out so that we don't get destroyed. And so they organised a delegation. Now I want you to notice that response to try and destroy their brethren. They were understandably angry at what they had assumed was taking place, because they were scarred by Achan, Korah and Baal Peor. But at the same time, brethren and sisters, there was an appalling inactivity going on amongst the tribes on the west. Just flick back to Joshua 15, verse 63. I'm just going to trace through only a few verses I could go through just to show you what's happening over on the west. So while the tribes are going across the Jordan, building the altar, across the river, going to their various inheritances and settling down, because they were settled down by the time the delegation arrives, look what's happening over in the west. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. And they were there until Joab got rid of them. Look at chapter 16, verse 10. And this is about Ephraimites and Manasseh on the west. And they drave not out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer. Now note that one. Just make a note of the 1st of Kings chapter 9, verse 16. Do you know who finally got rid of the Canaanites in Gezer? Pharaoh had to do that, brethren and sisters. In the days of Solomon, Pharaoh comes up and for a present to Solomon, he wipes out the Canaanites in Gezer. That's how long they got to stay there. But the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites unto this day and serve under tribute. They put them to work. They made a compromise against the law of God. In chapter 17, verse 12, yet the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites wanted to stay. Well, of course they did. So on the west, there's compromise all over the place in their own backyards. They are not doing what God said to do with the Canaanites. Everyone has to die, man, woman and child. But when we hear of apostasy across the river, we're going to rise up as one man to wipe out our brethren. How often has that happened in ecclesial life? Where there's a very slow reaction to what's quietly destroying our ecclesia and our own young people, but so quick to take up the sword to fight somewhere else. So back in Joshua 22, what they did was the right action practiced in totally the wrong spirit. They sent a delegation of leaders led by Phinehas. In verse 13, they got hold of Phinehas to lead 10 princes, so that's the 9.5 tribes from the west, each the chief house, to go across and to threaten and to warn. And that was the way in which they turned up. They turned up threatening and warning. Now, it was right to send a delegation, but they didn't do it as God had said. Just to come back to Deuteronomy 13. You know, here is the correct spirit in issues between ecclesias. And it happens on a personal level as well. But God had pre-told them what they should do. If you shall hear, they had heard, but they'd heard more just than the fact that an altar had been built. They had made very drastic assumptions as to what that meant. But if you hear, say, one of thy cities, certain men, children of Belial, are gone out from among you, saying, let us go and serve other gods. Now, they hadn't heard that. All they'd heard was that they'd built an altar. But if you hear something like this, the Lord said in verse 14, you shall inquire and make search and ask diligently. And if the thing is certain that such abomination is wrought among you, shall surely smite the inhabitants of that city. So there is justification for taking severe action if the matter has been proven. But you notice it says, inquire, make search, and ask diligently. And that involves listening, getting the facts first. Listening is not just checking what you have already concluded. It's getting behind and finding out why certain actions may have been taken, or even why a certain belief is being promoted. You have to investigate these things to make sure you understand what you're dealing with. And if there is apostasy, then the consequences can be severe. But you must first understand clearly, says God. You just don't rush to judgment. So back in Joshua 22, you imagine what this delegation was like. There are the 9.5 tribes, all sharpening their spears and organising themselves for the battle they see to come. And these 11 people, 10 princes and Phinehas, go across the Jordan, and on the way they're firing each other up with, well, we always expected this from this lot. You know, we know what these are like. These are the ones that didn't want to go to war originally. And, you know, Reuben, well, look at their history. And you can imagine, by the time they get there, they're not seeking a lost sheep. They're ready to fight a lion. Because they have already concluded in their minds that these people are apostates. And there's no objectivity about this. I always cringe when a brother says to me, if you heard about so-and-so, I'm applying Matthew 18. If he was applying Matthew 18, I shouldn't have heard about it. Because Jesus said, if you want to save your brother, like God does, then you go to him between you and him alone. And you talk as long as it takes until you need to bring in other people. But you do it by going between you and him alone. You do not tell me you're applying Matthew 18. You are applying a legal process that you have determined for yourself. And that's not the spirit of Matthew 18. In verse 16, you see something that often happens in inter-ecclesial disputes. They say in verse 16, thus saith the whole congregation of Yahweh, that you're committing a trespass. It's always typical to claim very wide support. The whole congregation says. The rest of them were just as ill-informed as were the delegation. That was no backup at all, that the whole congregation had it right. And then they bring out some key words of accusation, and I want you to colour these in. If you haven't got them coloured in, you should need to colour these in. You can colour them all in the same colour, because these are the key words both of the accusation and the careful response. And they are very, very particular words. The word trespass, Rotherham has an act of treachery. You imagine, you get a delegation turns up, and bear in mind there wasn't any phone call or email to say we're coming to see you. Here they are quietly starting to put up, all the spoil into their cities and organising the cattle, and all of a sudden, here's Phinehas. Now, we don't appreciate this lack of communication. They had no notification these guys were coming. And you can imagine them hastily assembling the elders of Reuben, Gad and Manasseh. Phinehas is here. And the first word you hear, what is this trespass that you have committed against the God of Israel? I mean, that's a great start to inquiring diligently, isn't it? They're already drawing their conclusions. And here are the words, trespass, an act of treachery, and turning away this day, rebellion and iniquity. Now you've got trespass and turning away this day in verse 16, rebel against Yahweh in verse 16, iniquity of Peor in verse 17, this day. Verse 18, turn away this day. Verse 18, rebel this day. Again in verse 19, rebel. Verse 20, trespass. The end of verse 20, iniquity. I mean, it's not exactly a speech designed to encourage brotherly love, is it? And they haven't heard a thing as to what the altar was all about. Now, these words were particularly significant because these accusations were based upon previous parts of Scripture. Now, Moses had said this in Deuteronomy 13. At the end of his speech, he said this, I've set before you life and death. You've got to choose. If your heart turns away, so there's turning away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods, and that was the assumption they had made, that they were now going to serve other gods. I declare to you, this day you shall surely perish. You will not live in the land, long in the land that you're going over to Jordan to possess. So they're quoting the scripture of Moses. Moses said, turning away This day will bring consequences. So they're using the words of Moses. They're using the words of Numbers 32 and verse 15. Just flick back there for a moment. Keep your hand there. Go back to Numbers 32. Their own covenant. In Numbers 32, verse 15. If you turn away from after him. You know, in Moses' initial burst of anger when they wanted to not cross over Jordan, Moses had said, you are turning away from after him. So they're picking up the words from there from Moses. So they're quoting from Moses when they bring up these accusations. Now look what they accused them of. These accusations were based upon Baal Peor, the transgression of Achan, and the rebellion of Korah. You're accused of apostasy, idolatry, and causing division. You've turned away, you've built an order that you might rebel. That's Korah, turning away. So you've broken the law of Moses. You're worse than the iniquity of Baal in verse 17. Is the iniquity of Peor too little for us? Now you want to do worse than Baal? Worse than what Balaam brought into us? Rebellion comes up in verse 16, verse 18 and verse 19. Over and over again. This is Korah all over again, they said. And transgression or trespass is the same word used of Achan, the troubler of Israel, in verse 20. Did not Achan commit a trespass in the accursed thing? Brought trouble upon the congregation? Iniquity? I mean, this was really a terrible, terrible litany of insults. That they were worse than all the great sins that had taken place in the previous generations. And it ends up with an incredibly cheap shot. I want you to read with me verse 19. It was very subtle, but it showed a great high-mindedness because it was a cheap shot at the inheritance on the east of Jordan. I'm going to paraphrase verse 19 for you. Well, if you find your inheritance unworkable, it's a long way from Shiloh over there. If you find your inheritance unworkable, why don't you come over and join us where we are strong, where we are closer to God over here? We know how to live the truth, and if you ask nicely, we'll let you in. And that's about what they said to them. It was a cheap shot at their inheritance. Well, you wanted to be over there, but you can come over here, where Yahweh's tabernacle actually is. And that was an insulting view of their inheritance. Never think that the way or the place in which we live the truth is the only way that God can work. If you ever start to think like that, you want to go and visit our brethren and sisters in Soweto, in Johannesburg, in Africa, where they live in the most difficult circumstances you could imagine. And they put us to shame with their zeal to preach the truth and to uphold the truth. Where they come out of shanty towns, dressed immaculately for the meeting, where they can open their Bibles, where their 25 friends come along to the first time, and you say Hosea and they can find Hosea. You know, never think that God is limited to do things the way that we think is the only way to do it. And that was a very, very nasty little comment that they made there, that your inheritance is not as good as ours. Now, how would you respond to that sort of tirade? Well, I know what my flesh is like. I find it incredibly hard not to fight back and interrupt people. And you see, what our brains do, our natural mind does, is it goes into the defence mechanism of very quickly adding up all the sins you can throw back in their faces. If it had been me there standing as the Reubenites, I would have said, now hang on, Judah, what about those people at Jebus? And Manasseh, what about those guys at Gezer? You know, I would have had some things to say to them, because I could have thrown back some very good insults. But you guys are not keeping the law of Yahweh. Did they do that? Well, no, we have this wonderfully restrained response. The Proverbs talk about the right attitude when we are faced with unfair accusations. A soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. You can throw petrol on the fire or water on the fire, And they chose to throw water on the fire. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." And we have to learn here one of the most valuable lessons that's so hard for human nature. Non-retaliation to evil. They listened patiently to Phinehas. They respected him as the great leader of Israel. And we can see the real evidence of their spiritual progress in the fact that they did not interrupt him until he had run out of gas. And this is so hard to do when you are falsely accused, to quietly listen and not start thinking of retaliation. When they spoke, there was no personal malice against Phinehas, no counter-accusation against the 9.5 tribes, no retaliation with evil insults, imputation of motives, not even a complaint about the audacity of the charges that had been made against them. What they did was to stick strictly to the facts of the case, the simple truth of the matter. The soft answer turns away wrath. And the spirit of non-retaliation was the greatest strength of our Lord Jesus Christ. We're told to follow in his footsteps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. Look what these guys did at the end of verse 23. If that's not true, what we've just said, then yet Yahweh require it of us. They committed themselves to him that judgeth righteously. Whenever there is a dispute between brethren, we do not have the right to add fuel to the fires of dispute by extra insults and threats. And some of us involved in the debate with the theistic evolutionists have had an incredible litany of threats made against us and abuse. I've been threatened with legal action from 2 sources for the things I've said. That's not the Spirit of Christ. And we must make sure that no matter what other people do in these controversies, that we do not fall into the trap of getting involved in personal abuse and insults. Reuben and Gad saved a pointless civil war by their careful restraint and their cautious reply. Now look what they say in verse 22. We read it as Yahweh, God of gods. It occurs twice in this verse. They actually double it as they begin their reply. It's one of the rarest of the divine titles that you will get. El, Elohim, Yahweh. Of course, the translators put it the other way round. But El, Elohim, Yahweh. The nearest in the law of Moses is Deuteronomy 10, verse 17. Yahweh our God, he's a God of gods. The only other exact time you find it is in Psalm 50, verse 1. Now, don't go there now, but you will read Psalm 50, verse 1, and it says this in verse 6 of Psalm 50, God alone is judge. And it's all about the judgment that God will execute in the earth in Psalm 50. So, the next time this El, Elohim, Yahweh is used in the Bible, it's a psalm all about the judgments of God. But they understood that he was a God of judgment, so they put this divine title in there. El, Elohim, Yahweh. It's a title that implies that God sees all and knows all. He can and he will punish evil. And their reply picks up 3 of the 4 stinging key words that have been thrown against them. They say in verse 22, save us not this day. In verse 22, if it be rebellion, if it be transgression, which is the same word as trespass. If we have built an altar to turn from following Yahweh this day. So they pick up almost all of the words that have been thrown in the accusation to say, well, this is what you are saying, but it's not true. And what we are saying to you by way of explanation is true. If it's not true, then we're happy for God to judge us. And only honest men are willing to call down the judgments of God upon themselves. And so they explain their motive in verse 24. The real motive is explained in verse 24 to 28. And it was the fear of isolation. That their children, who had not spent the 7 years with the others, might not feel connected. They might not know the kinship they'd experienced in 7 years of fighting together. They were concerned that those in the West might think less of them. Look at verse 25. There is a border that God has made between us. It's the Jordan. And we don't want you to say, you have no part in Yahweh. We don't want your children saying, who are those strange people from the east that come over occasionally? We want us to be united. We want our children to understand that we all serve the same God around the same tabernacle. We don't want our children to lose their spiritual roots because of distance. And in verse 27, we built this altar, they said, to be a witness that we do the service of Yahweh together. Before him, look at that, the service of Yahweh before him with our burnt offerings. And they've got that right about Yahweh going before us, haven't they? With our peace offerings, that your children may not say to our children in time to come, you have no part in Yahweh. This was meant to be a unifying thing, brethren. Something that was designed to highlight their common worship, their common heritage, their spiritual bonds, had sadly become a cause of civil war. It was never intended in verse 29 ever to be used for offerings. It was merely a physical, visual signal. They understood what Moses said about to only worship in the place of God's name. They were horrified that they were being accused of heresy so soon after fighting with their brethren. The altar was impractical in size for offerings. It was on the wrong side of Jordan for them anyway. If you were going to build an altar of apostasy, it would have been somewhere over in Gilead. Why build it on the other side of the river? It didn't make any sense, these accusations. How sad that something that was intended for unity became a cause for division. And there were two things lacking here. The first was communication. For all their good intentions, they should have sent somebody back to Shiloh to say, if you do hear about an altar, this is why we built it. So a little communication would have been very useful. But the worst problem was the lack of trust and goodwill from the West. They didn't even trust these people that had laboured with them for 7 years so that they could get their inheritance. And that's a very sad thing. And then we have verse 30 to 31, and we now see a very embarrassing moment for Phinehas. We know that because in verse 30 it says, now when Phinehas the priest, and there's a significant change of the way God describes Phinehas here only. Almost without exception in the divine record, when Phinehas is mentioned, is Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the high priest, or other words, Phinehas, the high priest elect. This is the lowest of all his titles in this particular point of his career. He's just the priest. Because this was his most embarrassing moment in a very zealous and God-fearing career. And even the greatest of men have bad moments, like Moses smiting the rock on the second occasion. For Phinehas, this was a very awkward and very public humiliation. And I imagine on the way home how different was the conversation amongst the delegation to what the outward journey had been. They would have been reflecting upon their own stupidity and their lack of consideration. And Phinehas takes the lead of all the elders. And it says at the end of verse 30 that what they heard pleased them. They were it was good in their eyes. And Phinehas makes a very gracious speech in verse 31, a very generous speech, which is much to Phinehas' credit. Really great people can admit that sometimes they do get things wrong, that they do make mistakes in their good intentions. And every brother I know that's had to make a public fight to preserve the truth can look back and review things and wish that some things had been done differently. And because we are human, we also always make mistakes when we're trying to handle difficult issues. And we realise we could have done things a lot better. And Phinehas is willing to admit it. Look what he says in verse 31. Now, you notice once he opens his mouth, God calls him Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest again. So God's now saying, this is the spiritual Phinehas. The one that's standing there with a red face in verse 30 is just Phinehas the priest. And now God says, when he opens his mouth, he's got his mind in the right place again. He says this day. Now he'd used that word this day against them in the accusation. This day you're turning away. This day you're rebelling. Iniquity this day. And Phinehas now says, well, this day we perceive that Yahweh is among us. You've not committed the trespass. So he's withdrawing his accusation against Yahweh. And what's more, brethren, your very restrained and honest and open reply has saved the children of Israel from the wrath of Yahweh. If they had gone to civil war, if Reuben and Gad and Manasseh had replied with similar insults and accusations, civil war would have erupted, and God would have been highly displeased with everybody, and he would have punished them for a wrongful war. And Eliezer says, your calm and rational reply has delivered the children of Israel from the hand of Yahweh, not from civil war with each other. God would have punished us had we made such a terrible mistake as going to war. Goes on in verse 32. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, he's now back in that elevated role. They came back and reported it to their brethren at Shiloh. It is always vital when you are sent on behalf of your ecclesia or ecclesias to represent others, that if there is a positive resolution or even progress in negotiations, that you report back faithfully. They had to go back and face 9.5 tribes who were gearing up for a righteous war. You can imagine coming back. When does the battle start, Phinehas? Can I lead the campaign? Can I have their spoil? There will be no war, brethren. And they reported it faithfully. There was no spin, no justification, and no lingering suspicions were allowed to be left. And it says, they brought them word again. And the children of Israel were delighted to hear that there was a positive outcome. The children of Israel blessed God and gave up all their plans to go to battle against their brethren. And you see, there needs to be a faithful report. You cannot slant or interpret the outcome to suit political positions. Well, we sort of resolved it, but you know, those guys, you can't trust them. You hear that kind of language, don't you, in the brotherhood? We don't add fuel to the fire to keep it burning. I remember one meeting in Australia where eventually a doctrinal issue was resolved. But before the meeting was allowed to be finished, somebody said, well, that might have been resolved, brethren, but what about your dress standards? What about the style of music you have? And all the good that had been done was completely demolished. And we hadn't come to discuss those things. See, some people just did not want there to be any unity resolved. But by a restrained and true report, civil war was averted. And the cause of friction now became a symbol of unity. Look what it says in the last verse. Both sides, they called it a witness, Ed. A witness between both sides that Yahweh is God, and that's not in dispute, brethren. No other worship will exist. And it now became the symbol of unity that it was always designed to be. So what are the lessons we take away from Ed today? Well, number one, with our zeal for God, let's make sure we start on the home front first. Before we get too indignant over other reported failures elsewhere, let's make sure we've got our home front sorted out. You know, they hadn't sorted out the Canaanites, and they would not ever sort out the Canaanites, most of them. Other people had to do it in later generations. Be swift to hear and slow to speak, and especially be slow to wrath. In times of controversy, the need to listen is vital. Seek, inquire diligently. One of the problems in our brotherhood is that quite often the first discussion, when there is the suspicion of heresy or error, the first discussion is very formal, the atmosphere very public, the situation confrontational. And no one wants to concede anything, even if they can see that they're not quite on the right track. How much better it would be that if there isn't a problem, that brethren first got to know each other personally. We had a 20-year fellowship division in Australia over the atonement. And one ecclesia was in error. But we got nowhere with meeting after meeting and statement after statement until two brethren agreed to meet for lunch from either side. Brethren from either side. Let's just go out and off the record find out exactly where the problem lies. And two brethren did that until they trusted each other. It did not ignore the issue. But eventually the brother whose ecclesia was in the wrong came to see it and convinced his ecclesia they needed to update themselves on the atonement. They were still living 50 years before. And the matter was eventually resolved. You see, it takes sometimes a bit of personal inquiry, off-the-record discussions, to actually find out exactly what we're dealing with. And then we have to appreciate that sometimes in matters of ecclesial difference, there are different perspectives. We need to understand why a particular position has been adopted and realise that we might look at it totally differently to other people. Classic example in the New Testament about meat offered to idols. To the Jews with their background, that was defiling. It was insulting to Yahweh to touch meat offered to idols. To the Gentiles, some of them said, well, I go there and take the meat offered to idols because I'm demonstrating my liberty in Christ. And they were both partly right, and they were both partly wrong. They both needed to see the other's perspective and not judge the other servants of God according to their own background. Now I want you to notice in Joshua 22, two words. At the end of verse 30, when the elders heard that, it pleased them. In verse 33, when they made their faithful report, it says, it pleased the children of Israel. And that is taken up many, many years later at the Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter 15. When the matter had been resolved, the doctrinal issue had been laid to rest, that you cannot command circumcision for salvation. That issue was non-negotiable. But when it came to the difference between the way that Jews and Gentiles observed life, there was a need for compromise and mutual understanding of the other position. And the decree of the apostles that the feelings of the Jews should be respected by the Gentile brethren, we're told it pleased the apostles. It seemed good unto us and to the Holy Spirit, was what they wrote. And there was a spirit of happiness that there had been a divisive issue resolved with cooperation and mutual understanding of the other perspective. And we must avoid hasty judgments. Never pronounce judgment without knowing the facts. You know, the wisdom of Solomon is very, very appropriate to us. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding. But he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. And for all of our determination to make sure we do the right thing and to protect our ecclesias from the inroads of error or immorality, brethren and sisters, there is a correct way to go about it. A wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeases strife. It doesn't mean we compromise. We do not exacerbate the problem by the attitude we adopt and the aggressiveness we adopt. And we certainly don't go and make judgments without knowing the facts. He that answereth a matter before he heareth it It's a folly and a shame unto him. And you can imagine the red face of Phinehas as he stood there hearing the patient, truthful explanation of Reuben, Gad and Manasseh. So the lessons we take away, brethren and sisters, are very simple. Do not be hasty to condemn on hearsay. Paul says love imputes, not evil. It doesn't believe the worst about people. It doesn't apply motives to what they do. You have to balance our godly zeal with trust, respect and fairness. If you are called upon to represent others, you must report faithfully and positively when there is a good outcome, and rejoice if unity is preserved. Surely we have learned the dangers of matters escalating because there was a lack of brotherly trust, or because insulting accusations were introduced into the argument about facts, or because no friendly inquiry was first made. We need to remember the sobering words of our Lord Jesus Christ. With what judgment ye mete, so shall it be meted unto you. It's Matthew 7 verse 2. Or as someone outside the Bible said, and I found this incredibly useful for myself, be sure your words are always sweet, as one day you may have to eat them. And that's what Phinehas had to do. So, brethren and sisters, rejoice if unity is maintained. Be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to wrath. And so we leave Israel, rejoicing in their inheritance with Abraham. And we trust along the way we've learnt from those things written for our learning and our admonition from the edge of the kingdom, and that we might apply them, because upon us the end of the ages are come. Because upon us